Great. So our next presenter is Stephen Lamonde of the eBird Atlas for the Monadnock region. Stephen is an avid birder. He is an affiliate professor at Antioch University, New England, where he teaches graduate-level GIS courses. He is also a full-time ecologist with Moosewood Ecological LLC, where he works closely with town conservation commissions and conservation-minded landowners throughout New Hampshire.
Okay, welcome. Who saw a bird this morning? It was raining when I left the house. I had a hard time. It wasn't until I got on campus and there was 2 common ravens flying over. So birds are all around us, and they're really easy to study. As Heidi was just saying about butterflies, they're often out during the day. Not all birds. We'd have to go out at night to find many owls. And so birds have a really captivating effect on humans. They've been with humans on Earth forever, and they've had a significant impact on our communities and our culture. But how are birds responding to climate change? We've probably seen a lot of the recent articles and studies that birds are declining all around the world, all different groups of birds, and for a variety of reasons. So one of the things that we can do to help our feathered friends is to study them, study their distributions, and look at their populations. So what I've been compiling in my free time, early in the morning or late at night, is an eBird Atlas for the Monadnock region, looking at the past 20 years of community science data. How many of you know what a bird atlas is? A couple folks. So maybe you've been involved in past bird atlases. They are a designated effort. Bear with me as I get the slides moving forward. Is there something special I need to do?
Sorry. It's a long way from the back of the room. If we go ahead.
Okay, great. Thank you. So breeding bird atlases have been around since approximately the 1960s. The United States Geological Survey did a lot of the initial work, coming up with a standardized method for tracking birds and their populations, usually at the state level or at the province scale up in Canada. Some states, like New York, I believe, have just completed their 3rd breeding bird atlas. In a good year, or really in a good century, they happen every 20 years. Now, New Hampshire's first and only breeding bird atlas was published in 1994. The bird data collected for this atlas was collected from 1981 to 1986 over that 6-year period. So we're coming up on 40 years since the last bird atlas was conducted for the state of New Hampshire. And since that time, bird populations have changed and changed dramatically. Not all bird species, but a good number of them. As you can see from these 2 graphs here, they're combined to all species in New Hampshire. There's about 270 regularly occurring bird species in the Granite State, and a little over 100 of those are declining. So how do we track those populations over time? Where do we track which species are declining, where their breeding grounds are, and how those are changing over time? It's difficult. Fish and Game does a great job, New Hampshire Audubon as well, but their funding is limited. They have limited staff. They can't get everywhere. And so they track the threatened and endangered species in the state. But what about the not so threatened but also declining species in the state? It's a little more difficult to get people out and track those populations in a meaningful method. Enter eBird. I am a self-proclaimed eBird disciple. No, I do not work for Cornell. I wish I did. eBird is a worldwide community science database where people submit their bird observations. It could be the robin on your feeder. Maybe it's a golden eagle up on Pack Monadnock. Any bird, anywhere, anytime, forever is the name of the game with eBird. You don't have to be a professional scientist. You don't know how to identify a salt marsh sparrow from a Nelson sparrow. If you just know what the bird is that you're looking at, you can enter it into eBird. And so it's this huge data set that's available to the public, not just for education and learning about birds, looking at recent bird sightings in your own backyard, but also studying them. Every week, a new scientific discovery comes out using eBird data. So how does it work? eBird is based on the checklist format. when you see a bird, it's also important to note the date, time, and location and what you saw. If you want to go into more detail, you can add additional species that were there at that time, how long you were out observing birds, and how far you were traveling. All of this information is really critical for answering a broad array of scientific questions. And so here's an example checklist recently from November 4th near where I live in Hancock. And in this checklist, I've recorded all this critical information to help scientists learn about the birds in my own backyard. Now, I'm not the only eBird user in New Hampshire. In fact, there are thousands of us, and I hope to encourage some of you to join the eBird community today. So with this eBird Atlas, I had a series of goals. This is a picture, black and white image from the original Breeding Bird Atlas for the state of New Hampshire. I said, well, this is really great. This is good information, but it's 40 years out of date. What do the birds look like now? And so to walk you through this map here, each open grid square was a block, an atlas block that was surveyed during the Breeding Bird Atlas. It was colored in with a different shade of black or a different shape, depending on whether or not the species, brown creeper in this instance, was confirmed breeding in that atlas square. Birds are confirmed breeding if you find a nest with eggs, if you find evidence of a nest. Other times it can't be quite confirmed, but it's probable that the bird is nesting there. Say you had a singing bird present for over a week, or there was a male and female cardinal courting one another, but you couldn't find the nest itself. So there's different levels of confirmation available when it comes to breeding bird information. So with this atlas, I first and foremost wanted to visualize the spatial distributions of species throughout New Hampshire, just to get an updated sense for how species were moving in the past 40 years. Second, I wanted to map species richness, so a count of species in each town and each atlas block throughout the state. Now, with all community science data, it's highly correlated to effort. Where are people looking for the animals that they're documenting? So I wanted to map birding effort throughout the state of New Hampshire to find the underexplored places and send people out there to document what birds were in those areas. I also wanted to inspire more local birding. Climate change is an issue. We love to drive to the seacoast to see more birds quickly, but there's plenty of birds to see and study here in our own backyards. And lastly, I hope this presentation raises some support and awareness for how badly we need another official breeding bird atlas. So this atlas is not a replacement for an actual breeding bird atlas because it uses eBird data, which is a little less standardized than what you need for an actual breeding bird atlas, but this is a step in the right direction. So for my project, I've defined the Monadnock region as Cheshire and all of Hillsborough County. That's debatable depending on where you live, but it's really easy to sort eBird data based on the county scale. And I used a 20-year time frame rather than the standard 5 or 6 because of that difference in effort. eBirders are typically out whenever they have free time, whereas if you're working in an eBird atlas, you're going out weekend after weekend, putting in a lot of time and effort in a small area, hence the 20 years. So my first step is to download the eBird data. This is a snippet of a massive data set. It's too large to open up in Excel, actually, so you need to work with it in a larger program, something that can handle that. So I turned to RStudio, working with R. There's specialized packages available for working with eBird data, such as Awk and a couple others. Once I had the data processed, I then turned to map making, mostly in ArcGIS Pro for this presentation, but I used some other software to make the maps more quickly. So let's check out a couple summary statistics for the Atlas period using Cheshire and Hillsborough counties. 78,000 eBird checklists have been submitted during that 20-year period, so this is a large N data set, just from the southwestern corner of New Hampshire. Over 3 million birds have been counted by volunteers during this 20-year period, and 299 species have been observed also during the Atlas period. So a great amount of diversity. Almost 3,500 people have contributed to this effort. They didn't know it was going to be used for this atlas when they started, but I used their data. We've traveled almost 35,000 miles just in these two counties in the past 20 years looking for birds. And lastly, we've accumulated 145,000 volunteer hours. So people are out there. People are looking at birds, counting them, documenting them. How can we use this local data source to figure out where birds are, how their populations are doing, and then prioritize which lands and watersheds should be conserved? So what does the data look like in my own personal atlas? It looks like this. This is the atlas square blocks for the Monadnock region. And I've color-coded them very simply to start out, where if a species is reported, the block shows up in green. If it's unreported, it shows up in gray. Very intuitive. Any guesses what species this might be for? I hear a couple people guessing, right? This is the black-capped chickadee. 100% coverage in the region. There's a couple gray squares on the edges. This is really just an edge effect from clipping the eBird data to the Monadnock region. Chickadees have been documented here, but they're just over the border in Rockingham County. So throughout the Monadnock region, yes, chickadees are very common, very abundant. Let's take a look at another species, a little less common. This is the eastern screech owl. We see a large concentration here around Hollis and Nashua, down in Hinsdale, and a couple spotty reports here and there. And then lastly, a rare bird. This is what shows up for more rare and uncommon birds, like the greater white-fronted goose. This is a European species that shows up during usually spring migration when it's mixed into larger flocks of Canada geese. A couple concentrations of observations here and there, but very sparsely distributed throughout the Monadnock region. So once I made maps for all 299 species in the Monadnock region, I said, well, where have the most birds been seen? I want to go there. Well, it turns out Hinsdale setbacks, Lake Wantasticket, over there in southwestern Cheshire County, has the most bird species documented in those atlas blocks. And then right here, south of Keene, that's the Dillon Hopkins Airport in Swansea. A lot of people go there because there's a high amount of habitat diversity in a small area. So there's a lot of bird species there as a result. But we're starting to pick up on a couple other spatial trends. What's going on down here, southern Cheshire County, or over here near Francistown, and up towards Goffstown? These are areas that definitely have more birds than are being documented in that 20-year period. So if any of you live near those grayer areas, spend some time there, document those birds, and help out this Atlas project. How many of you know what Atlas block you live in? Marlow 3, Alstead 6, Dublin 1? Nobody. So this data needs to be more user-friendly. So I took an approach of mapping the distributions at the town level, which is something Fish and Game does and where I got this inspiration to do this. So here's the black-capped chickadee once again, 100% occupancy in all the towns in the region. Eastern screech owl, again, we see that clustering. This has an interesting spatial pattern if you're familiar with the Monadnock region. Eastern screech owls are a lowland owl in this part of the state. So we see Connecticut River Valley, Shualet River Valley, Kentucky River Valley, and the Merrimack River Valley. So if you're going to look for eastern screech owls, start in the river valleys. And then lastly, the greater white-fronted goose at the town scale. Migratory goose mixed in with large flocks of Canada geese. If you know something about waterfowl migration in the spring, they stick to large river valleys. Hence the Connecticut River Valley in Walpole and Hinsdale, and the Merrimack River Valley towards Merrimack and Nashua. So once again, combined species richness for all the towns based on eBird data from 2000 to 2020, we end up with a map like this. Again, Keene, Swansea, Hollis, Nashua, Manchester, really populated places, more people, more eBirders, more effort, more species. We go to towns like Troy and Greenville, Bennington, I believe, very little birding effort, hence low species. Doesn't mean there's fewer species there, just less effort. This is a gray area in our understanding of bird populations in that particular town. So to better understand this effort and how the eBird community is moving about the landscape and documenting birds, I went back to the Atlas block scale. These Atlas blocks are about 3 miles wide and 2.9 miles high. And because of that standardized size, the data is more easily interpretable, and each square is equally compared to other squares on the map, whereas towns have varying sizes and are less equally compared. So here's our distribution of the Atlas effort from 2000 to 2020 overall. Again, we see pockets of high effort, over 600 hours in each block, closer to these larger communities. But I wanted to break it down by seasonality, and I got some interesting results here. This is during spring migration. So a fair amount of effort, again, actually Hancock, Harris Center area, pretty well birded during spring migration, probably all the programming that the Harris Center does. But there's a couple spots in the middle of the region with 0 hours. No effort, period. So these are high on my visit list for this upcoming spring, just to document the birds that are moving through there. And yeah, I'll probably get blue jays and chickadees along the way, but maybe I'll find something cool like a Tennessee warbler migrating with that flock. During the breeding season, we actually see less birding effort than during the spring. So these colors are on the same scale for each season map. And I don't know what's behind this trend. Maybe it's all the Antioch students have gone out for internships away out of state, and they're no longer documenting birds. Again, we see the clusters and the typical largely populated areas, but there's a lot more gaps where no effort has been put in to document the birds. You know, up in Walpole and Alstead, places close to Distant Hill Gardens, which is right there, could really benefit from some effort. We move on to fall migration. Again, similar pattern, a little bit more effort overall than during the breeding season. And this patch right here is new. This is Monadnock, where the Harris Center and Hampshire Audubon have had a long-term hawk migration study going on, and somebody's up there 8-10 hours a day. So that gets a lot of effort, a lot of visitors, a lot of party hours. It was great to have that documentation right there for Monadnock. But there are a lot of other places, the eastern side of Pisgah State Park, that really don't have any documentation. And then lastly, during the winter, we see a little bit of a mix. I found this little smiley face here, if anybody else can visualize that. And so there's still data gaps in our region, but a fair amount of winter effort, more than I was expecting, which is really good. So eBirding your Christmas bird counts can be a great method to increase the sampling throughout the area. So these maps were a great exploration of what's been documented from 2000 to 2020. The species maps were handy, presence, absence, but they don't really indicate trends over time. So I went back through the data and created these series of maps for all 299 species, starting with, I'll highlight 2 or 3 species here. The first, the American kestrel. This is a species of special concern in the state of New Hampshire, something the Harris Center is actively looking to conserve land and set up monitoring nest boxes for this species. Fairly common in the right habitat where it does exist, but there are a couple places where they haven't been recorded recently. Do they still exist in these towns? We don't really know without people visiting these places and looking for kestrels. So these 2 towns in particular are of serious interest to me. It's been more than 10 years since kestrels were reported there. Here's the eastern whippoorwill, somewhat of an uncommon bird throughout the Monadnock region. Again, sticking more towards the lowlands on either side of the Monadnock Highlands. But there are, again, several towns where it's been multiple years since they've last been documented. So are these populations actually changing, or was there a local birder that just moved away 10 years ago? It's hard to say without repeated sampling effort. And then lastly, our purple finch, the state bird of New Hampshire, fairly common at one point of year or another, but it's, again, up in Sullivan and Hudson. We should make sure those birds are still there. So a couple notable changes. I went back through my own eBird data and eBird data from the region, compared it to the original atlas, and made these well-known discoveries, I think, just evidenced in the data. So purple martins and olive-sided flycatchers used to be breeding in the Monadnock region 40 years ago. They are no longer present. And most people have been birding in the area for a while and know this. Purple martins and olive-sided flycatchers really throughout the state have declined. Other species that are still present, but much less so than before: American black duck, bank swallow, cliff swallow, Swainson's thrush, Nashville warbler, and dark-eyed juncos. A lot of these are common species, but they are declining in this part of the state. On the bright side, Carolina wrens and red-bellied woodpeckers did not exist in the early 1980s in southern New Hampshire. They weren't included in the breeding bird atlas whatsoever. But here they are, they're breeding, there's probably 100 every square mile in southern New Hampshire. Bald eagles and osprey were also not documented as breeding in the Monadnock region 40 years ago, but they are confirmed breeders in this part of the state nowadays. Still sparsely distributed, but they are present. And a couple other increasing species. As the winters get a little more tolerable, we're seeing more wild turkeys, tufted titmouse, and northern cardinals. They're really spreading rapidly. My time is up, so I'm going to just quickly run through these. I do have a Google Drive that's publicly accessible. You can sign up today if you want advanced access. This will all be published next year. There's a lot of maps to check out. If you want to get involved, certainly keep up the eBirding effort, join the eBirding community, and I'll take some questions.
Questions for Stephen? Yes, sir. So the question was, if you can't make a positive identification, can you still use eBird?
You certainly can. I think I gave this example to somebody else earlier today. Sparrows are difficult. We all know that. If you don't know what kind of sparrow it is, you can still enter it into eBird as a sparrow species. And anybody studying sparrows will still use that data point, which is still helpful. Great question.
Which really struck me. And my question is whether you assume that the next time a formal atlas is done, it will all be done through eBird, and that'll just kind of streamline data entry processing.
So the question was, will the next atlas be done exclusively through eBird? Is that what you're saying? Or be the data collection tool for the next atlas?
I think there's a 90% chance the answer is yes. The state of Maine just wrapped up their 5-year bird atlas. Well, this winter is their last season, and they ran the entire thing through eBird. So one of my next steps for this project is to map the highest breeding code for each town and atlas block for each species. So stay tuned.
More questions? Yes?
Sometimes I wonder about this. Does the hotspot system of declaring certain spots better for birding actually decrease the amount of data because it draws birders to certain areas while leaving others unbirded?
Yeah, so the comment was about hotspots and whether they're sort of a residue of interest in going to those places to see birds and not necessarily a good measurement of the number of birds in those places. Is that okay?
Yeah, so
Okay, thank you.
hotspots are great if people are visiting from out of town. It's a good spot to go to see a lot of birds fairly quickly. But yes, they can, Sam's always going to the airport, not just for birds, but also for caterpillars. But there are other birds elsewhere that are equally worthy of study. So go to the hotspots, a couple times a year for sure, but also go to your backyard, get permission from your neighbor to check out their land, or any local town publicly accessible forest. All that information is really, really valuable.
Peter?
How is the atlas going to be published? And where I think an atlas is a big book.
You mentioned a Google Drive. Is it going to be virtual or physical?
I don't have a budget to publish a book. I haven't gotten any requests or donations. So this will be publicly accessible on Google Drive. There's 1,600 maps out there now, more on the way. And it does cover the state of New Hampshire. I wrote the abstract for this presentation. I said, actually, I'm going to do all of New Hampshire at this point, rather than just the Monadnock region. And so those maps are available at the state level. So you can send me an email. My contact info is in the the program, to get early access to that. But I'll just have a published digital copy out next year.
Time for another question? Sure. The question is, does Merlin, the Cornell app, link or integrate with eBird?
They're both made by the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. There is a way to submit your sighting from Merlin to eBird. It's not my personal preference to do that, however. I will make a quick note that Merlin is a great educational tool. It's great for learning about birds, especially their songs and calls, but its identification is right maybe 80% of the time. So if it's seeing something like a white-eyed vireo, definitely try to see that bird rather than just listening to it to get a confirmation. So it's a great tool, but we're not encouraging folks to submit Merlin observations to eBird yet because it's not a perfect software. Great question.
Great. Is there, yep, one more question, then we'll have to break.
So I noticed the time frame for your map was 2000 to 2020. So if we all start entering data today, when will that data appear on the maps?
So the question is, if we all start entering data today, when will that data appear on these maps?
Well, if I had a paid gig to do this project, it'd be weekly. Since I'm just doing this volunteer, my goal is to update it annually, which I think is pretty fair. So my goal is every January to update all of the maps so people can go out, oh, I still need to find a common yellow-throated in Greenville. You know, they'll have a little to-do list each year for their own town. So that's my goal.